Right, there's a concept that's been doing the rounds recently, which is minimum viable company, taken from a little bit of the minimum viable product mindset. What are your thoughts on that? Is it a theoretical concept or something that can really work in practice?
So I think a lot out there at the minute is theoretical, but this is it's a new concept. Not very many companies will have implemented this or thought about it, but it can be really practical and it can be achievable. I think what's helpful to do is probably define what we think it is, and what ultimately we think it isn't. So if we think about resilience as a whole, we've got important business services. We've mapped all of those services, and we've mapped all of the pillars, right? But when you think about extreme disruption and you think about some of those most severe cases, right? We've all seen them in the news. What happens when you're under duress for a period of time and you have to make those real explicit trade-offs? It becomes less then about important business services and it becomes a question about survival, right? And that's where we think MVC comes into play.
So turning that concept from theory into practice, what are the things that companies should be thinking about?
So I think first and foremost, this isn't just a technology problem. There's obviously technology that can help with this sort of stuff, but ultimately this is about leadership and about what decisions and trade-offs that leadership are willing and able to make during those really extreme scenarios. And I think ultimately you've got to define that, right? So this is a problem around, right, can we align leadership on defining what that MVC would be prior to something happening and not doing it in the moment? And that's where I'd maybe start.
And Ryan, the timing for MVC and the concept and the discussions around it, what's driving that?
So I think there's probably two things. There's we've had the regulatory deadline in financial services. So most organisations will have met that deadline. They'll have done all of the things that regulation set out, right? They'll have mapped their important business services, as we've already mentioned. They will have mapped all of the component resource pillars, and they will have conducted an element of testing. But I think this becomes a question around, are you sort of resilient on paper, or are you genuinely resilient? And would you actually be able to survive those most, severe disruptions, whether that would be a catastrophic cyber incident or whether that would be a really severe technology outage, right? And I think this is where MVC comes into play, because it takes that, it takes your organization as a whole and it forces you to think about, right, under those circumstances, what would we absolutely need to keep running and what decisions would we need to make in order to keep the firm viable? And I think that's where MVC comes into play. We've done a lot of the legwork, or a lot of organisations will have done a lot of the legwork, and it now comes into, right, can we make this organisation genuinely resilient? And I think to be able to do that, you've got to understand what your minimum viable company is.
So one of the things that I've not been too clear on at this point in time is whether this is really shifting from concept into practicality. Mm-hmm. Where do you see our clients in this space? Are they actually starting to make any traction? Are there programs and projects that are underway to define an MVC?
Yeah, so I think they are. It probably splits into two. There are probably some that might see this purely as a technical solution. So creating a lifeboat system, for instance, that might, they might be able to recover under one of those scenarios that we've already spoken about. Others might be seeing it slightly more holistically, right? So taking the approach of actually defining what it is, going through all of those steps, running those workshops to understand, right, are we aligned on what we think our absolute minimum version of ourselves is? I think the approach should probably be the latter, because in order to be able to recover effectively, you've got to define what is absolutely necessary and what's important and what we must maintain to be able to survive. And that's not just a subset of important business services, right? There are nuances and complexities about how you might define that. So I think ultimately what you want to do is make it really practical. What you don't want to do is keep this idea theoretical or hard to understand and hard to implement. And I think it starts from leadership, because if you don't have leadership buy-in and you don't have their sort of clear view on what's important, And again, framing it under the right context as well. So framing it under those most severe circumstances.
One of the things that I've seen is probably the different categories of organisations who are in the midst of thinking about this. I don't think I've actually seen many that have shifted to, here's a full definition of our MVC. Most conversations that we are having today are really around what is an MVC, how do we implement it? So a lot of companies are really getting their head around how do we make this practical, how do we make this commercially viable without spinning up a whole replica of a whole business, which clearly wouldn't be cost effective and the right thing to do.
And most companies will not have the appetite to do that, right? And again, you know, the question is, right, okay, I understand the concept, you've sort of told me what the concept is, well, what do I do about it? Right? And this doesn't need to be an all singing, all dancing, bells and whistles solution, right? There can be some real practical steps to get you to, you know, 80% of the answer.
Yeah. And who, in your view, is or should be taking the lead on defining the MVC and building a program? Who's the kind of the exec sponsor for something like this?
So I don't think, again, if we think about what we spoke about before around this not being a technology problem, the coup could be a really good exec sponsor, a good broad understanding of the entire organisation, well placed to be able to sponsor, will not just view this as a technology problem, but will also view this as a business problem, as a leadership problem. But ultimately, it needs to be the exec team, right? Because they're the people that are accountable and responsible, and are the ones in those circumstances that are going to be making those explicit trade-offs that we've already spoken about. So it needs to be a leadership decision, probably sponsored by someone like the Q, but led at exec level, facilitated probably by a central resilience team if you've got one.
And if you're going to give 3 top tips on starting your definition of MVC, what would they be?
Get leadership buy-in, clearly articulate what you think the MVC is and what it isn't, and articulate why it's not just a technology problem. And really delve into what's important in that organisation. Think beyond just important business services and think slightly more broadly, and really understand that within the context of those really severe scenarios that we've spoken about.